the world's oceans, from the tropics to the polar regions. There's a tremendous interest in the large number of reserves that have been implemented. But even so, the total area covered by most of these reserves is quite low, generally less than 1% of the coastal ocean. As we talked about in the fisheries lecture, the world's oceans are in trouble. Global fish catches are declining, numerous populations of marine animals have collapsed, and communities and habitats have been extensively damaged or destroyed. Evidence is mounting that MPAs, or marine protected areas, where fishing and other human activities are restricted or prohibited, can conserve habitats and protect populations. However, despite their growing significance for policy, we have little data on how much MPAs cost to establish and run, how these costs vary, or whether a substantially expanded global network of MPAs could be affordable. To address these questions, we'll talk about many aspects of MPAs. First, definitions. Although there are varying definitions of MPAs, just like many terms we've talked about, we have a general definition for our purposes. This can also include the terms marine reserves and marine protected areas. But for our purposes, we're looking at any areas of the coastal zone or open ocean that confer some level of protection for the purpose of managing resources or protecting vulnerable or threatened habitats and species. The level of protection provided by these species can vary from no-take marine reserves to extractive activity marine reserves, and we'll talk about those in subsequent slides. I'd like to provide a historical perspective of MPAs because the issues that have emerged in the interest of establishing reserves are actually quite long-standing. As early as the 14th century, there are references in which concerns about the ecosystem effects of harvesting on marine systems have been voiced and even put into legislation. In the 14th century, there was a petition put before the Commons in Britain to ban a certain type of dredge in sensitive habitats. We would recognize the rationale for this ban today as one designed to preserve ecosystem structure and function. This shows that the issues we're dealing with today are nothing new. Similarly, in the 15th century, trawling was banned in Flanders, again with the very clear ecological rationale for banning this particular type of fishing gear. Different types of trawling were banned again throughout the 16th and 17th century in different areas. In fact, trawling was even made a capital offense in France. This makes it quite clear that there was a general and long-standing concern in these areas about the potential impacts of fishing gear on marine ecosystems. And here I just have a picture to remind you of what a trawl is doing and functioning like. You have two doors or boards and a chain, as well as the net, which are dragging across the bottom of the ocean, changing the ecosystem as well as taking fish. Here are two legal definitions of an MPA, quite wordy, one by the IUCN, which we've talked about in previous lectures, and one also an international definition. These two definitions might be considered to be the most commonly used, but there is no single internationally accepted definition of an MPA. The definitions are often adapted to fit specific objectives. Here in the United States, we have several acts that also protect and deal with MPAs. The Magnuson-Stevenson Act, which is aimed to rebuild and maintain sustainable fisheries within ecosystem context. The National Marine Sanctuaries Act, which is a place-based designation and management of nationally significant marine ecosystems. And the Sanctuaries Act, which has similar goals and gives regional fishery management councils the opportunity to deal with regulations. Under these regulations, and now these are IUCN categories, you can have different amounts of protection conferred to an MPA. They all target different types of specific management actions. They can be protected for science, for wilderness protection, for ecosystem protection, for conservation of natural features, for conservation through management intervention, for seascape conservation and recreation, and for sustainable use of natural resources. Here in the United States, we have more than 1,700 MPAs, putting about 41% of all the U.S. waters in some form of MPA. The majority of the U.S. MPAs are located within the Virgin Atlantic marine ecoregion, which extends along Cape Hatteras northward to Cape Cod. State and territorial governments occupy about 75% of the nation's MPAs. No-take MPAs are only about 3% of all U.S. waters. Here's a map demonstrating some of the main MPA locations. As of March 21st, 2016, as we talked about in the Galapagos example, the Ecuadorian president signed a decree declaring that 32% of the Galapagos Marine Reserve was now a no-take reserve. This is an area about the size of Belgium, and it will be off limits for fishing in order to conserve sharks and their unique habitat. This is an exciting example of how large areas of the ocean can be set aside for very specific species and their protection. Economics supported this idea by a 2015 study that calculated that the tourism value of a shark in the Galapagos is about $5.4 million, whereas a dead shark brings in less than $200 US. These were the sort of economics that demonstrated an MPA like this was possible. However, as you read in the article, and I'll show you some graphics from this now, there are potential benefits of marine reserves. They can potentially increase the abundance and biomass within a reserve, increase the average size of animals within the reserve, and increase the reproductive output by having animals attain a larger size. There's the potential to enhance yield in adjacent fishing grounds outside the MPA. There is quite convincing evidence that within closed areas, abundance and biomass have increased, as have the average size within the boundary. Enhanced yield has been demonstrated in some systems. There's a lot of work going on in this region, but it does show that we need to look at more intensively how we evaluate the utility of marine reserves to meet fishery management goals. There are also studies that show that MPAs can increase community stability, species diversity within the reserve. They can reduce the fishing down the food web that we talked about in fisheries, and they can even reduce use conflicts among different recreational, commercial groups. When we're evaluating reserves, we need to keep in mind the whole suite of fishery-related and non-fishery-related potential benefits that can come about from the use of reserves. Here's some data that you'll recognize from the PISCO report you read, demonstrating that the biomass of animals and plants increased an average of 446%. The density, or the number of plants and animals in a given area, increased an average of 166%. Body size of animals increased an average of 28%. Species diversity increased an average of 21%. And this was seen to be greater in temperate than in tropical areas, indicating location dependence. One frequent expectation of the use of MPAs in management of fisheries is maintenance or enhancement of yields in areas adjacent to the actual reserve itself. This can be by adult or post-settlement movements, so-called spillover effects. However, demonstrating this effect has been relatively rare. The paper I've pulled out here reports on some evidence derived from underwater scuba censuses that looked at the densities of large predatory coral reef fish, the Serranidae, inside and adjacent to a small marine reserve in the Philippines. It's also unusual because it looked at this over a 10-year period. It has been protected from fishing, this marine reserve has been protected from fishing for the duration of the study, whereas the non-reserve has been fished using traditional fishing gear, bamboo traps, hook and line, and spears. The study found significant positive correlations of both density and species richness of the large predatory fish that increased with the duration of reserve protection. And we saw this increase both in the reserve and the non-reserve areas, indicating circumstantial or limited efforts, indications that the spillover effect was occurring. Larval spillover is a little more difficult to demonstrate because larval spillover larvae can be harder to measure. This study looked at 2 species of coral reef fishes with different reproductive strategies that occupied a relatively small coral reef surrounding an island recently designated as an MPA in Papua New Guinea. The two species were the orange clownfish, which spawns demersal eggs that hatch over several days of parental care, and larvae that spend 11 days in the pelagic environment. In contrast, they also looked at the vagabond butterfly fish that releases gametes directly into the water column. That is, there is no parental care. And then the larvae spend a longer average period of time in the pelagic environment, up to 38 days. It's the second fish, the vagabond butterfly fish, that has the most common reproductive strategy that most marine fish use, and that most targeted species use throughout the world ocean. In this study, they tagged larvae using a method by which mothers transmit stable barium isotopes to their offspring before hatching and dispersal. They used about 175 and then 120 fish from the reef. They were injected with this solution and then returned to the reef. They then could estimate from the larvae that 60% of self-recruitment for these two species. This demonstrates that the larvae were capable of returning to a very small target reef, even after extended larval duration. There was high levels of self-recruitment, but 40% of the juveniles of both species came from outside the MVA. So this demonstrated that there was some larval spillover. This is the sort of information that's being distributed by California Sea Grant, looking at the fisheries effects, the community effects, and the evolutionary benefits provided by marine protected areas. So what's the role of science in MPA creation? Science in general, and particularly ecology, has played an important role in linking the different phases of the development of MPA policy. Early efforts by scientists began by identifying the needs for and the potential management roles of MPA. This involved censusing and identifying threatened species. This work not only raised the visibility of MPAs as a potential tool, but helped clarify the objectives and goals of the MPA. Those could be used to design effective continuing management of the MPA. So for example, in identifying rare and threatened species, one example is the black-spotted grouper in New Zealand, and studies indicated that this species was particularly vulnerable to overfishing. Concern for the species led in part to the creation of an MPA in the Kermadec Islands, making it the largest marine protected area in New Zealand waters. Persistence of the population of the species within the MPA suggests that from a conservation perspective, the MPA has been successful. Science has also played an important role in demonstrating how important species diversity is in maintaining the structure, i.e. the composition and relative abundance of species, and the function of an ecosystem. It's highlighted the value of protecting and preserving biodiversity and maintaining the integrity of ecological interactions. For example, when a particular species, especially predators high in a food web, are removed, like we've talked about in other examples, unforeseen effects can cascade throughout the ecosystem. One example is right here on the coast of California, particularly Central California, where sea otters graze heavily on sea urchins and limit their numbers. Otherwise, high densities of sea urchins could overgraze kelp forest and create barrens similar to those described in the New Zealand example that I talked about in the previous slide. South of Point Conception, throughout Southern California where we are, the sea otter is absent, but spiny lobster and large wrasse called sheephead both feed on and limit the abundance of sea urchins. Both the fish and the lobster are heavily fished throughout Southern California. Changes in any of these three species can play an important role in determining the condition of the reef habitat. So if you look at this graphic here, you can see that these three species play a role in determining whether we have barren grounds or kelp beds. Another contribution scientists have made is in identifying the value of protecting fish so that they can grow large and reproduce. In the early 1990s, scientists compared the fecundity and egg production of a 60-centimeter red snapper with that of a 40-centimeter red snapper. Despite the fact that the older, larger fish is only 1/3 greater in length than the younger fish, this increase in length translates into a 12-fold increase in biomass. Moreover, the larger fish produces the same number of eggs as 212 of the 40-centimeter fish. This difference emphasizes how the relationship between fecundity and fish size increases disproportionately as older fish allocate more energy to reproduction, while younger fish allocate more energy to growth. Just like we tried to do in class, we need to provide estimates of how much MPAs are going to cost, because cost-benefit analysis comes into the process of decision-making and policy. This particular study provided an estimate of the cost of a global MPA network based on a survey of the running cost of 83 MPAs worldwide. Annual running costs per unit area spanned about 6 orders of magnitude and were highest in the MPAs that were smaller, closer to the coast, and in high-cost developed countries. This paper then extrapolated these findings to suggest that a global MPA network, meeting a target of conserving between 20 and 30% of the world's oceans, might cost between $5 billion and $19 billion annually to run and would probably create around 1 million jobs. Although a substantial cost, the gross network costs are less than the current government expenditures on subsidies to industrial fisheries. The graphic on the next page shows these same estimates. Similar to what we talked about setting up marine reserves in lectures, this looks at how we might model the percent coverage versus the cost and compare this to fishing subsidies. The shaded area denotes recent estimates of global subsidies to industrial fisheries, whereas the vertical dashed lines show the MPA coverage recently recommended by the World's Parks Congress. The authors ran different models to look at whether we should randomly locate, randomly with neighbors locate adjacent non-randomly, or target selection. And it shows that the models would cost less if we really targeted and set up a network of MPAs, the bottom model there. Defining these specific objectives of an MPA requires us to ask fundamental questions regarding design, especially with respect to conservation of biodiversity. How big should MPAs? Well, we can say that most studies addressing this question suggest that MPAs should be large. One reason for this is because few studies that have examined the relationship between area and species diversity most studies indicate that diversity increases with area, as we talked about. Thus, the larger the MPA, the greater the number of species protected. Another reason for a large MPA is that it protects a greater representation of the habitats that an individual uses during its lifetime. Fish can shift among habitat types as they grow because they require different resources, like food or habitats for reproduction. I'll show an example. In addition, they can incorporate adult or larval movement. The bigger the MPA, the more likely larval dispersal will be contained within the MPA, allowing these protected populations to be self-replenishing. How many MPAs should there be? There's numerous reasons why this is many, but it also indicates that we need adequate habitat and biogeographic representation. And in order to do that, we need many MPAs. What type of population should we include? And where do we locate MPAs are all important questions. If we look at this, this looks at adult movement, again from the article you read, and says that in order to protect species of interest, the MPA needs to be large enough to encompass the movement of adults. This shows the range of adult movement for species of interest. It ranges from very short distances, 0 to 1 kilometers, to greater than 1,000. It should also potentially include dispersal of juveniles, larvae, and egg, and this varies enormously among species. Some barely move from their natal site, others disperse vast distances. MPAs will only be connected through the dispersal of young if they're close enough together to allow movement from one MPA to another. Any given spacing of MPAs will undoubtedly provide connectivity for some species and not for others. The challenge is minimizing the number of key or threatened species that are left isolated by widely spaced MPAs. So pelagic duration, i.e. the time in the plankton as larvae, is often used as a proxy for dispersal potential, as seen here in the Shanks et al. 2003 graph, looking at propagule duration and dispersal distance. Several studies have made an attempt to model how MPAs are placed and where they're placed. Figure 1 here from a Sala 2002 paper shows a map of the Gulf of California with the location of the study areas and sampling sites. It also shows in Figure B the gradient of species richness of reef fishes on shallow rocky bottoms. Other habitats showed similar patterns with decreasing species richness and increasing latitude, as we talked about. The next stage of this exercise was proposed networks of marine reserves for the Gulf of California that were on the left-hand panel biologically optimal, and on the right-hand panel a network that reduced social conflict by excluding areas where fishing pressure and conservation collide. The small arrows point to planning units that were removed in the left-hand graphic and added on the right-hand graphic to the network when considering fisher pressure. Smaller reserves were aggregative planning units. Well, this demonstrates that the use of explicit socioeconomic variables in addition to the biological biodiversity data is important, because in marine systems where fishing is a major threat, ecological criteria and socioeconomic measures are not independent. Moreover, solutions can be presented to decision makers who can evaluate the costs and benefit of different management options with the socioeconomic constraints applied on top. Prioritization of the reserves can be carried out using both of these factors. How do people feel about MPAs? In 2003, 2006, and 2009, studies by the Public Policy Institute of California showed that 75% of people surveyed supported creating marine reserves off the California coast. This percentage dropped to 64% when people were asked if managers could exclude all people. So this resulted in some creation of marine protected areas throughout California, including those around the Channel Islands, those in the Point Conception to California-Mexico border, where we have a variety of protections from state marine reserves to marine conservation areas to special closure areas. How do we come to consensus to put these into a network? That's the exercise we're going to do today. Each one of you will, or tomorrow, each one of you will have data about the following animals: kelp, lobsters, marine mammals, commercially valuable species like California halibut, iconic organisms like our state fish. We also have information about yellow rockeye and red snapper and albacore. We'll have a Simpson's Diversity Index. You will be divided into 6 groups: fishermen directly involved in the fishing industry, members of the Native American tribe, local business owners and employees, members of a national conservation organization, scientists and their funding agencies, and citizens of the place. We will evaluate how marine reserves should be set up and how marine reserves should be classified using these characteristics. I will show both of these slides and explain more about the activity when we do this exercise in class.